Uh, so will you listen to the word of God with me as I read it? So our text, I'll share just a little bit. Our text is a familiar one, but I want you to listen carefully because it's a story that's in all the Gospels and you've heard it 1,000 times. And so just maybe take a moment to listen more deeply and listen to this particular version. What's here that you didn't hear, you don't remember, or what are things that you are missing in this text that you remember from another reading? So the text is from the book of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And as he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. So send all of these people away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we going to buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And then he ordered them to get all of the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before all the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. And those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I want to thank you all for having me today, and in particular, I want to thank Pastor Julie for inviting me. We serve together on the ministry relations team of the Presbytery, which is a team of the Committee on Ministry, and so it is a joy to be here as she is traveling this weekend. Will you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts and prayers and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So this is one of my absolute favorite stories in the Bible. It's also one of the most difficult to preach because you've heard this sermon 100 times, and I am sure that Pastor Julie has preached it better. But this story sits at the heart of my theology. It's at the heart of my sense of call to Bread for the World, which is a ministry to which I was ordained 10 years ago. Bread is a collective Christian voice urging our nation's decision makers to end hunger in the U.S. and around the world. And that's a fancy way of saying that we are a Christian advocacy organization working with churches around the country to ask Congress to pass policies and legislation that will move us closer to ending hunger in our lifetime. there is something special about feeding people. Food nourishes our bodies, but serving food, feeding people, builds and restores relationships and connection. And if we're paying attention, food comes from a whole system that can remind us of our interdependence as humans and as creation, and our utter dependence on God. Growing up, my family gathered around the table at dinner each night, and while it wasn't always successful, our parents hoped that this would be a time and a place for us to share our stories of our day, to have conversations, to check in, to connect with one another. As adults, though, it's much more successful. When we are home with our parents, we continue to practice this effort. We gather around the table for hours at a time, chatting and joking and sharing the stories of our lives, arguing about politics, and just catching up with one another. And we have this tradition where when we sit down to a meal, no one can eat until the person who cooked the meal can start eating. And believe me, that takes patience because my mother and my chef brother always want to take care of those last minute details before sitting around and making sure everybody's got food. Of course, growing up in the South, hospitality was a really important part of my culture, as it probably is yours too. And I don't mean to brag, but hospitality is a little bit my superpower. And I know people hate waiting tables. It's like the worst job ever, so take care of your servers when you go to a restaurant. But there's something really special to me about serving someone a meal. And I think it just reminds me of Jesus when he's serving the disciples that last meal together, that motley crew of people who are about to desert him and really didn't understand what they had while Jesus was around. There is a beauty in hospitality, a holiness in it for me. And it's this radical hospitality of Jesus in this story and the story of the Last Supper that always reminds me of the importance of feeding one another. In my recent reading of this story, I am struck by how it begins. The apostles have been sent away to preach and teach and heal people. And as they're returning, they want to share with Jesus all that they have done. But it's a busy place, and people are coming and going, and it's so busy that they don't even have time to eat. So he invites them to go away to a deserted place by themselves. And they set out on a boat to this deserted place. I wonder what comes to your mind when you think of a deserted place. I think of a place that was where there was once human activity, but there is none anymore. I think of the quiet of no human voices and the loudness of the silence, the loudness of nature around. I think of the place that has been abandoned, that is no longer tended to or cared for. I think of overgrown weeds and trees and birds' nests in weird places. And one might expect to find some privacy in a deserted place. And yet here, there is none, because all of the people from the towns and villages nearby figure out where Jesus and the disciples are going, and then they run ahead on foot, arriving before they do in the boat. The text says that Jesus saw the people and had compassion for them, and they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, sheep are not known for being the smartest creatures. They travel in herds, and they're minded by shepherds and corralled by sheepdogs. And sometimes the sheep wander off into danger, and the shepherd will go looking for that sheep. But a flock of sheep without a shepherd is likely abandoned. One might say deserted. So here we are in a deserted place with a deserted people, and Jesus has compassion on him, and so he begins teaching them. The text doesn't say what he's teaching them. It doesn't get into the details there, but we know that the disciples begin to get a little antsy as time ticks on and the sun begins to set. I wonder if their trip on the boat didn't allow enough time for their rest or allow enough time to share with Jesus all that they had done and taught. And perhaps they just want Jesus to themselves, a little time for retreat. Perhaps they're hungry and they want to eat that little bit of food that they have tucked away in their overcoats. So they tell Jesus to send the people away so they can go and buy food for themselves in nearby villages. But Jesus replies, "You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat." This is radical hospitality. And when I think of deserted people in our day, I think of the 18 million U.S. households that at the pandemic's height said they did not have enough food to eat. The 8.8 million children who lived in a household where even the children weren't eating enough because caregivers couldn't afford enough food for them in the last 7 days. This is a lot relatively. Adults generally try to direct resources toward children to shield them from food insecurity and hardship. And they couldn't. The fact that they couldn't at this time means that families have so few resources, they can't protect children from hunger. The rate of hunger among Black and Latino households is regularly 2 and 3 times that of white households. I think of the 12 million adults in U.S. households with children who, as of last May, report that they still do not have enough to eat. I think of the approximately 720 to 811 million people worldwide who faced hunger in 2020. I think of the child that dies of malnutrition every 11 seconds, although malnutrition is entirely preventable. 6 years ago, the world was on track to end hunger by 2030. And now, taking into account the last effects of the pandemic on the global food security, we can project that 30 million more people will face hunger by 2030. That's nearly double the U.S. population. Friends, these statistics are sobering, and behind each of them is a story of a parent pacing the floor, trying to figure out how to cover medical bills and the mortgage and still put food on the table. A mother is working 2 jobs, trying to figure out how to get enough food to feed her children so that she doesn't have to skip meals, trying to find time to spend with her children to nurture them. A family is fleeing violent conflict of war with only the belongings on their back that they can carry. And Jesus says, "You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat." Friends, you've heard the statistics. We can't food bank and child sponsor our way out of this food crisis. We need bigger and better solutions. We need radical solutions. And some of these solutions involve changing policies and programs and conditions that cause hunger. I understand you are a Matthew 25 congregation. And Pastor Julie says that maybe you don't all know what that means. I looked it up on the internet to find out. It's a relatively new program of our denomination that allows churches to designate themselves, and presbyteries and synods to designate themselves as Matthew 25 congregations, because they make 3 commitments. 1, to build congregational vitality. 2, to dismantle structural racism. And 3, to eradicate systems of poverty. This commitment to congregational vitality includes challenging yourselves, your neighbors, and your congregation to deepen your faith, to get actively and joyfully engaged with your community and the world. Dismantling structural racism is a commitment to advocate and act to break down systems, practices, and thinking that underlie discrimination, bias, prejudice, and oppression of people of color. Eradicating systemic poverty is a commitment to working to change laws, policies, plans, and structures in our society that perpetuate economic exploitation of people who are poor. Congratulations on making an incredibly bold and hopeful commitment to this world. These are daunting tasks, however, and I'm a little exhausted thinking about the list, and it's overwhelming to think about how we might do any of these, much less all of them. The truth is that we're in a hard place. Many of us are exhausted. We're living in bewildering times. We have been living through a global pandemic that has pulled back the curtains and revealed the ugly truths of the world around us. And for those of us who could see it before, it's just so stark now. We've been living with stressors and uncertainties, and each of us has a laundry list of losses. We've experienced changes we've gone through and crises in our families and our communities that we have managed, and our political system is a mess. And all of this has surfaced big questions for many of us about how we want to live our lives, how we want to spend our time each day. Life is short and it's precious. And what is the point of running ourselves ragged with things that are not meaningful, purposeful, and joyful? This is hard stuff, friends. This is hard stuff of living. It's stressful, but it reminds me that in the beginning of our story, Jesus is taking the disciples away for some much needed rest. And by now, we've all heard about how important rest is for our brains and our bodies and our souls. Rest is critical. But how do we ensure that everyone has an opportunity to rest? How do we ensure that everyone has enough so that they can also find rest from our stressful lives? In this story, the answer from Jesus is radical hospitality. Instead of sending everyone away to do the work of finding food, the disciples work together to ensure that everyone has enough to eat. Jesus has compassion on the crowd, not just through his teaching, but also through their nourishment. But the truth is, we can't do it all. There's an incredible amount of need out there, and we must follow where God is leading us and respond to what God is putting before us. And you all are no strangers to this work with your new building here. Our job is not to change the world, it is to work together to do our part. The disciples didn't do the work alone. They gathered what they had, they listened to Jesus' instructions, and God did the rest of the work. God went before them. For me, I feel called to feed people, not through a food bank or a food pantry, but by changing the policies, programs, and conditions that cause hunger through advocacy to Congress. Our work at Bread for the World allows us to impact millions of lives, from our neighbors next door to our neighbors around the world, by advocating for legislation that will address this hunger crisis everywhere. We invite churches like yours to participate in an offering of letters. So instead of collecting money to address hunger, we collect and bless offerings of letters to Congress. We offer the power of our collective voices and our influence to make a difference. Bread is a nonpartisan organization working in bipartisan ways because we believe that lasting change comes when we can work with the broadest and most politically diverse coalition of leaders. And yes, Capitol Hill is broken. You might think that advocacy doesn't work, but the statistics and research again and again convey that advocating, changing laws and policies, enacting just legislation works. It may not be the only solution, but it makes a difference. Your members of Congress assign their staff to read every single letter that comes into their office, and they count how many letters for each topic. And a mere 12 letters is enough for a member of Congress to pay attention. 12 letters. You all could write double that in 5 minutes. You might think, I'm not an expert on hunger. I don't know enough to be able to do advocacy on these issues. And what can I do as one person? This work is also about building relationships. Just as it's important to build relationships with our neighbors, it's important to build relationships with our leaders. As people of faith, as Christians, we don't have to know all the ins and outs of policy and legislation about hunger. We can tell our elected leaders why the issues are important to us, why our faith tells us that this work is important. Feeding 5,000 men, and that doesn't even include the women and children who were likely present too, making this crowd more like 12,000 was a daunting task. But Jesus puts his disciples to work saying, you give them something to eat. He inquires about how much food they have, and when he learns of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he orders them to assemble the crowd into groups. And then he takes the loaves and he looks up to heaven and he blesses them and he breaks them, and he did this as he did with the fish. And he distributes the broken bread and fish to the disciples to share with the crowd. There's a system here. It's a bunch of people working together in order, and they collect 12 baskets of broken pieces and all are fed. In this story, Jesus does the hard work. God does the hard work. The disciples just follow his lead. We too are not alone in this work. We go where Jesus directs us to go, and we follow what Jesus tells us to do. I want to share 2 things. One is a story about Bread for the World member Connie Wick. She lived in Robin Run retirement home, and she regularly wrote to her senator about hunger issues. She organized regular letter writing in her retirement home, as she had done in her church before moving to Robin Run. And one year, this is a while ago, President George W. Bush was asking Senator Lugar about why he supported the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a program for distributing foreign assistance that focuses on countries with good governance, country-led and implemented solutions, and tracking results. And Senator Lugar responded that he supported the legislation because he had received daily letters from Connie Wick. Connie was not a wealthy contributor to a political party. She had never run for public office. She was just one woman, one voice, one person who felt that the U.S. should do more to feed hungry people. And that year, the Millennium Challenge Corporation funding rose from $1 billion to $2.5 billion. Connie Wick's stories don't happen all the time, but they happen. Connie Wick wasn't the only one writing letters. She was just the one consistently writing letters. Our work is collective. That is why we are a collective Christian voice. The other story I want to tell you is about the Global Malnutrition Prevention and Treatment Act of 2021. Our staff of policy experts and researchers worked with other non-NGOs in the DC area and worked with members of Congress to write some legislation that would improve nutrition for women and children around the world. And so together, they went to Congress and they asked these members of Congress to write some legislation, and they provided talking points, and the legislation was written in 2021. And our churches, the churches with Bread for the World and folks around the country advocated for this legislation, and it is bipartisan. So there were Republican and Democratic senators and Republican and Democratic House members who co-sponsored this legislation and got all these members of Congress to sign on. This legislation will provide greater strategic vision, coordination, effectiveness, and accountability in U.S. government's existing global nutrition efforts. It will mitigate and prevent future crises and malnutrition and hunger crises, and it will ensure that tens of millions of children have a chance not only to survive, but to thrive. It passed in a bipartisan way in the House just a couple months ago. It has cleared the way in the Senate for unanimous consent, and we expect this legislation will land on the president's desk in September. And it's because of churches who write letters, who call their members of Congress, that this is possible. Proverbs 31:8 reads, "Open your mouth for those who cannot speak and for the rights of those who are left without help." Friends, you have the power to make a difference in this world. You have a voice. You are part of the community here at Fairlington Presbyterian Church, and I want to invite you to consider how you will deepen your commitment to justice in this world. If you feel called to work on hunger advocacy, you have a partner in Bread for the World. You are not alone. Our staff can provide resources and support for an offering of letters here. But Bread for the World is not the only organization out there working on important issues. Our denomination's Office of Public Witness, just here in Washington, D.C., works with lots of organizations that you can get involved with. What is your passion? What breaks your heart? What gifts and talents do you have to offer? Where is God leading you? And what has God put before you? How will you, both individually and collectively, grow deeper into this Matthew 25 commitment? Jesus ordered the disciples to gather people in groups, and they gathered them in 50s and 100s, and they placed the food, broken and blessed, before them. Just as he gathered the disciples around the table, where he washed their feet, blessed and broke food, and poured wine to serve them, he served them so that they might serve others. Friends, the invitation is there. You give them something to eat. Amen.